She looked at the old man sitting alone, his eyes lost in the dim glow of a tiny Christmas tree. "Don't you have anyone to spend Christmas with?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. He shook his head, silent, distant. She slid a slice of cake across the cold table, smiling through the ache in her chest. "Then may I be the first tonight?" The old man studied her long and carefully, and then he leaned forward and whispered 7 words that changed her life forever. 3 days later, a call from Washington shattered everything she thought she knew. The life she thought was ordinary wasn't, the man she thought was a stranger wasn't, and the quiet kindness she gave without a second thought would return in a way she never could have imagined. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The snow had been falling since late afternoon, and by the time evening settled over Willow Creek, Montana, the town looked like a scene out of an old Christmas card. White rooftops, glowing windows, and streets so silent that the only sound was the crunch of boots on freshly fallen snow. Inside the Willow Diner, the air was warm and smelled of cinnamon and coffee. A string of colored lights framed the windows, casting soft reflections onto the polished counter. The jukebox in the corner hummed a soft carol, one of those old songs about coming home for Christmas. Emma Collins wiped down the counter, for the third time, her rag moving in slow, absent circles. Her apron strings were tied loosely at her back, and a smudge of flour streaked her forearm. There were only a handful of customers tonight, a pair of truckers in the corner talking low over their coffee, a middle-aged woman reading a dog-eared novel at a booth, a man in his 70s dozing over a half-eaten slice of pie, and Emma working Christmas Eve because the diner needed her, or maybe because being here was easier than being at home decorating a too-small tree with her mother and pretending they didn't notice the empty space where her father should have been. Samuel Collins had passed away that spring, a quiet man with a ready smile who had served his country in a war he never liked to talk about. Afterward, he'd lived simply fixing cars, helping neighbors, teaching Emma how to fish, and fix leaky faucets. He had never been the kind to boast. His medals stayed in a box under the bed. His stories remained mostly untold. Now it was just Emma and her mom in the small apartment above Dawson's General Store, figuring out how to keep moving forward without him. The clock above the kitchen door ticked toward 9. Snowflakes swirled against the windows, turning the world outside into a soft, shifting blur. Joe, the diner manager, poked his head out from the kitchen. "We're closing up in 15, he called out. "Unless you feel like working the graveyard shift too?" Emma smiled faintly. 15. Sounds perfect. Joe grunted and disappeared back into the kitchen. She finished wiping the counter, straightened the napkin dispensers, and was reaching to turn off the neon open sign when the bell above the door jingled. Emma turned, expecting maybe a last-minute customer picking up pie for their family dinner, but it wasn't that. An old man stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders. His coat was threadbare, his boots scuffed and cracked. His silver hair hung in soft, uneven tufts from beneath a faded cap. For a moment, he just stood there, blinking against the warm light. Emma hesitated. She caught Joe's eye through the pass-through window. He gave a shrug that said, "Your call." She could have told him they were closed. She could have turned him away. Instead, Emma stepped from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "Come on in," she said, her voice soft. "You're just in time." The old man smiled, a small, grateful smile that tugged at something deep inside her. He shuffled toward a booth by the window, moving slow, like every step took effort. Emma grabbed a menu, even though she doubted he'd need it, and followed. "Here you go, sir," she said, placing it on the table. "Can I get you some coffee to start?" He nodded, settling into the booth. His hands, knotted with age and lined with scars, rested quietly on the table. Emma poured him a steaming cup from the pot she carried, setting it down with a small clink. "Take your time," she said, smiling. The old man stared out of the window for a long moment, watching the snow. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just a bowl of soup, if you have it." Emma felt her throat tighten a little. She knew the kitchen had some leftover potato soup. It wasn't much, but it was warm, hearty, and better than nothing. "I'll bring it right out," she said. As she turned to leave, she paused. On impulse, she walked over to the display case where the last gingerbread cookies sat, slightly chipped, but still decorated with bright red and green icing. She tucked it onto the plate next to the soup without charging him. No one should be without something sweet on Christmas Eve. The old man ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a feast. Emma busied herself refilling the sugar caddies and wiping down the coffee machines, but she kept glancing over at him. Something about the way he sat quiet, grateful alone tugged at her heart. When she brought the check, she hesitated. "Sir," she said, her voice softer now, "don't you have anyone to spend Christmas with?" The old man set down his spoon, his eyes meeting hers. They were startlingly clear, a sharp gray that seemed to see straight through her. He shook his head slowly. Emma pressed her hand lightly on the cold tabletop, not quite sure what else to say. "May I?" She hesitated, then smiled shyly. "May I be the first one tonight to wish you Merry Christmas?" The old man's face softened, lines creasing in a way that suggested a lifetime of both sorrow and joy. He studied her for a long moment. Then, leaning forward slightly, he whispered so softly she almost didn't hear 7 words that froze her in place. "You are your father's daughter, truly." Emma's breath caught. For a moment it felt like the world stopped the ticking clock. The falling snow, even the soft carols in the background. She hadn't mentioned her father tonight, hadn't worn her name tag, hadn't said anything that could connect her to him. Yet somehow this stranger knew. Before she could gather her thoughts, the old man reached into his coat and pulled out a carefully folded $5 bill, placing it gently atop the check. Far more than the meal had cost. He gave her one final nod, a nod full of something she couldn't quite name, and rose stiffly to his feet. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but he was already moving toward the door, the bell above it chiming softly as he stepped back into the swirling snow. She rushed to the window, peering out. But the street was empty, just the soft whirl of white under the street lights and footprints that faded quickly under the falling snow. Emma returned to the booth, heart still pounding. On the table beside the bill was something else, a small folded piece of paper. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. Inside, in neat, careful handwriting, were just a few simple words. "Thank you for keeping kindness alive." Emma sat down heavily in the booth, clutching the note. Outside, the world continued, and cold, vast, and uncaring. But inside this tiny diner, in the quiet of Christmas Eve, a spark had been lit. A reminder that even the smallest acts of goodness, a warm bowl of soup, a smile, a cookie given without expectation, could ripple outward in ways she might never fully understand. The diner felt impossibly still. After he left it, Emma Collins sat quietly in the booth where the old man had been, the folded note trembling lightly between her fingers. "Thank you for keeping kindness alive." She read the words again as if they might change, as if maybe she had imagined the whole thing. The snow continued to fall outside, swirling under the street lamps, cloaking the world in a soft hush. Joe wandered out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He gave a glance around the empty diner and frowned slightly when he saw her still sitting there. "You all right, Em?" Emma looked up, blinking out of the daze. "Yeah," she said after a moment, her voice a little hoarse. "Yeah, I'm fine." Joe eyed her for a second longer, then shrugged and went back to counting the register. Emma stood slowly, folding the note carefully and tucking it into her apron pocket. She finished her closing duties mechanically, wiping down tables, refilling the napkin holders, stacking the chairs onto the tables, all the while feeling a strange, lingering warmth blooming quietly in her chest. When everything was done, she grabbed her coat and stepped out into the snowy night. The cold hit her immediately, biting through the thin fabric of her jacket, but she didn't rush. Instead, she stood for a moment on the diner's front steps, staring down Main Street. It was so quiet, almost holy. Christmas lights blinked from windows, their reflections shimmering on the wet pavement. A wreath hung on the lamppost across the street, its ribbons fluttering gently in the breeze. Emma wrapped her scarf tighter and began the walk home. Her boots crunched through the fresh snow, and her breath rose in little clouds around her face. She passed closed shops with festive displays, tiny trains circling miniature villages, mannequins in red dresses, shelves stacked with gingerbread houses. It should have made her feel lonely, but somehow tonight she didn't. Tonight there was something different in the air, something she couldn't quite name, something that felt like hope. The apartment above Dawson's General Store was dark when she reached it, except for the soft golden glow spilling from the living room. Emma slipped off her boots, dusted the snow from her jacket, and patted inside. Her mother sat on the worn sofa, a crocheted blanket pulled around her shoulders, the small Christmas tree glowing beside her. Claire Collins looked up and smiled as Emma entered, a smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. "You made it home before midnight," she said teasingly. Setting aside the mug of tea in her hands, Emma hung her jacket and joined her, sinking into the opposite end of the couch. "Slow night," she said simply. Claire nodded. Slow everything these days." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the faint crackle of the radiator, the gentle hum of Christmas music playing softly from the old radio in the corner. Finally, Emma reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the note. She turned it over in her hands once, then offered it to her mother. Claire unfolded it slowly, reading the simple message. Her eyes softened immediately. "What's this?" she asked. Emma told her about the old man, about the bowl of soup, about the 7 whispered words that had stopped her heart. "You are your father's daughter, truly." Claire listened without interrupting, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When Emma finished, the room seemed even quieter than before. For a long moment, Claire said nothing. Then she reached over and picked up a small picture frame from the side table. A photo of Samuel Collins in his army uniform, young and smiling, standing in front of a faded American flag. She traced his face with her thumb. "You know," Claire said, her voice thick with memory, "your father was a quiet man, but he wasn't just quiet because he preferred it." Emma looked at her mother, waiting. "There were things he carried," Claire continued softly, "things he couldn't talk about. Mission secrets. Promises he made." She smiled a little sadly. "He once told me that the greatest acts of courage weren't always found in grand battles. Sometimes they were in the quiet choices, the small kindnesses, the promises kept without anyone ever knowing." Emma blinked back sudden tears. "He would have been proud of you tonight," Claire said. Emma looked down at the note again, feeling the weight of it settle into her heart. Maybe the old man hadn't just been talking about her resemblance to her father's face. Maybe he had seen something deeper. Something Samuel Collins had planted long ago. A legacy of goodness passed down not through stories or medals, but through quiet actions and gentle strength. Later that night, after her mother had gone to bed, Emma sat by the window watching the snow fall. She held the note loosely in one hand, the photo of her father propped on the windowsill beside her. Out there somewhere beyond the falling snow and the darkened streets was a man who remembered, who had carried gratitude in his heart for decades and chose tonight to pass that gratitude forward. And it all started with a simple bowl of soup, a moment of kindness given freely without expectation. Emma smiled through her tears in a world that often felt too rushed, too loud, too cruel. Maybe the quiet moments mattered most. Maybe they were what kept the world spinning even when everything else seemed lost. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass and closed her eyes, whispering into the night, "Merry Christmas, Dad." 3 days later, the snowfall had eased, but the cold remained sharp, turning Willow Creek into a frozen world of sparkling rooftops and frosted windows. The holiday rush had faded. Christmas trees, once proudly displayed in front windows, now drooped slightly, their needles shedding quietly onto carpeted floors. The air carried the weight of the season's end, a kind of stillness that always felt heavier after the lights dimmed. Emma Collins bundled herself in her thickest coat and made her way to the diner for her morning shift. The town was slowly returning to its normal rhythm. Children sledding on the hills behind the school, Mr. Dawson grumbling good-naturedly as he shoveled the sidewalk in front of the general store, the scent of fresh bread drifting from the bakery. Yet beneath the ordinary pulse of Willow Creek, Emma carried a quiet sense of something shifted. Something awakened. She reached the diner just before sunrise, the horizon tinged with the softest hint of gold. Joe was already there, fiddling with the ancient cash register that always jammed when the temperature dropped below freezing. "Morning, Em," he said without looking up. "Morning," she replied, hanging her coat and tying on her apron. The diner still held the remnants of Christmas, the wreaths drooping slightly, the lights above the counter blinking a little slower. She smiled to herself as she filled the coffee urn, savoring the familiar routine. It wasn't until an hour later, as she was wiping down the counter between the morning rush, that she noticed it. A plain envelope tucked beneath the napkin holder. No stamp, no address, just her name printed neatly across the front. Emma hesitated for a moment, heart skipping strangely before sliding it free. She glanced around the diner, was nearly empty now. Just Mrs. Atkins sipping Sayini by the window, and a young couple arguing quietly over a map. No one seemed to be watching. Emma opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of heavy cream paper and a cashier's check. She unfolded the paper first. The note was short, simple, written in the same careful hand as the message left on Christmas Eve. "Some gifts are meant to be passed on, for your education, for your kindness. Thank you for reminding the world it still matters." Emma stared at the words for a long time before setting the paper down and looking at the check. She blinked. $25,000. Her knees wobbled slightly. She gripped the edge of the counter, steadying herself. This had to be a mistake, some kind of prank. Things like this didn't happen. Not here, not to her. But the note, the handwriting, it was the same feeling she had carried since that snowy night, an invisible thread tying kindness to kindness across time and circumstance. Joe wandered past whistling tunelessly. "You okay?" he asked. Emma quickly slipped the note and check into her apron pocket, hard hammering. "Yeah," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Just a lot on my mind," Joe shrugged. "Aren't we all?" He disappeared into the kitchen again. Emma stood there frozen, feeling the weight of the unexpected gifts settle around her like a heavy, comforting quilt. Somewhere out there, someone had remembered. Someone had decided that a bowl of soup, a gingerbread cookie, and a warm smile on a lonely night deserved more than silent gratitude. Emma wiped her hands and stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the crisp, icy air. The sun was rising now, painting the snow with a wash of pale golden pink. She closed her eyes, letting the cold bite her cheeks, the world filling with a bright, aching clarity. She thought of her father, how he had taught her without ever saying it aloud that the smallest things mattered most. A hand on a shoulder, a door held open, a word of encouragement offered when no one else noticed. She thought of his quiet faith, that goodness mattered even when it seemed invisible. And she realized that he had been right. Kindness didn't need a stage. It didn't need applause. It only needed a willing heart. That evening, after her shift ended, Emma sat with her mother at their kitchen table, the envelope and note between them. Claire Collins read the message twice, then looked up at her daughter with shining eyes. "You deserve this," she said simply. Emma shook her head, overwhelmed. "I didn't do anything." "You did exactly what needed to be done," her mother said gently. "You offered kindness without expecting anything in return. And sometimes that's the rarest thing in the world." They sat together in silence, the lamp casting a soft circle of light over the table. Finally, Emma spoke. "I don't know who he was," she said. "The old man. I don't even know if it was really him who sent this." Claire smiled a little. "Does it matter?" Emma thought about it. The diner, the soup, the gingerbread cookie, the quiet words whispered across a table, the footprints in the snow fading before she could catch them. No, she thought, it didn't matter. What mattered was the kindness passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart, unseen but undiminished. A legacy stronger than names, stronger than time. She folded the letter carefully and placed it into a small wooden box on the bookshelf, the same box that held her father's old fishing lures and faded photographs. A box of memories, a box of beginnings. Over the next few days, Emma made quiet plans. She met with the town's only lawyer, Mr. Henderson, about setting up a small scholarship fund in her father's name. She met with Mrs. Atkins about organizing a free Christmas Eve dinner the following year, open to anyone who needed company. No questions asked, and she visited the local community college, picking up applications and brochures, her heart thudding with a mixture of excitement and terror. Maybe she could study nursing, she thought. Maybe she could help people the way her father once had. The possibilities felt dizzying. But they felt real. For the first time in months, Emma looked at the future and saw not just empty space, but a path narrow, winding, but solid beneath her feet. All because of a simple moment, a simple choice to be kind when no one was watching. One night, close to New Year's, Emma stood again by the diner's front window, watching the snow fall. In her hand was another gingerbread cookie, this one baked by her own hands, slightly crooked but frosted with bright, cheerful colors. She wrapped it carefully in wax paper, slipped on her coat, and stepped out into the freezing night. The streets were empty, the town wrapped in the deep hush of winter. Emma crossed to the old bench near the bus stop, the one where lonely souls sometimes waited for rides that rarely came. She set the cookie down gently on the bench, a small offering, a silent blessing. Then she turned and walked away, her heart full, her footsteps light against the snow. Somewhere behind her, unseen and unnamed, the gift waited. And Emma knew somehow, some way, that it would find the person who needed it most, because kindness had a way of circling back. Always. Even when no one was watching, especially then a year passed. Seasons came and went in Willow Creek with the quiet, unhurried rhythm of a town used to enduring both long winters and long silences. The grief that had once wrapped itself around Emma Collins, like a heavy, suffocating blanket, softened over time. It didn't disappear. Not entirely, but it folded itself into the background of her days, woven into the fabric of her new life. She had started nursing school that fall, driving 40 minutes each way to the small community college in the next county. The days were long, the work demanding, but every late-night study session and early morning commute felt like a tribute to her father's memory. Samuel Collins had believed in service, in kindness, in standing quietly in the gap where others faltered. Now, Emma carried that belief forward, one class, one patient, one small kindness at a time. Still, she had made herself a promise. She would come home for Christmas, and she would not come empty-handed. On December 24th, just as the first snow of the season dusted the rooftops of Willow Creek, Emma stood once again outside the Willow Diner. It looked almost exactly as she remembered: the same worn stools, the same chip counter, the same jukebox in the corner that still leaned slightly to the left. Only now a handmade banner hung in the window, strung with simple white lights: Christmas Eve, community dinner. Everyone welcome. Emma smiled as she pushed open the door. Inside, the diner was already filling. Old Mr. Parker, who had lost his wife the previous spring, sat at the counter, chatting with Joe, who was manning the coffee pots with surprising cheer. Mrs. Atkins and her sister were setting out trays of cookies and pies donated by the town's few remaining bakers. A young couple with two small children squeezed into a booth near the window, brushing snow from their jackets and laughing softly. And in the center of it all stood Emma, apron tied neatly around her waist, her hair tucked under a red and white knit hat her mother had made. She moved through the room, pouring coffee, refilling plates, offering smiles. Not rushing, not hurrying, just being present. It wasn't about the food, though. There was plenty. It wasn't about the decorations, though. The diner glowed with warmth. It was about the space, the invitation, the reminder that no one had to be alone tonight. Near the front window, Emma had set up a small table, one seat, one plate, one cup of coffee. At the center of the table stood a framed photograph of her father, Samuel Collins, wearing his army fatigues and a soft private smile. Beside it, a simple handwritten card, reserved for all who gave quietly and for those still giving. Several people paused by the table throughout the evening, some bowing their heads briefly, others simply resting a hand on the back of the chair before moving on. Emma watched them with a soft ache in her chest. This was why she had come back. This was why it mattered. Around 8 o'clock, as Emma was carrying a fresh pot of coffee around the room, the diner door opened again. The bell above it chimed, and a gust of cold air swept inside, carrying with it a boy no more than 8 or 9 years old. He stood hesitantly just inside the threshold, clutching a worn backpack, his coat several sizes too big, the sleeves swallowing his small hands. Emma immediately moved toward him. "Hey there," she said warmly, crouching slightly so she wasn't towering over him. "Cold out, huh?" The boy nodded. Eyes wide, Emma smiled. "You're welcome to come in and warm up. We've got a hot chocolate and plenty of food." He hesitated, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to stop him, to turn him away. When no one did, he stepped forward slowly. Emma guided him to a booth near the kitchen, the warmest spot in the diner, and placed a mug of cocoa in front of him, the steam curling invitingly into the air. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry. Sometimes kindness meant letting someone keep their story until they were ready to tell it. She simply brought him a plate of turkey, mashed potatoes, and a slice of pumpkin pie. He ate slowly, methodically, as if unsure when he might get another meal like it. Emma stayed nearby, refilling cups, wiping down tables, making sure he had everything he needed without making a fuss. As the evening wore on, the boy finished his meal and sat quietly, hands folded around the warm mug. Emma slid into the booth across from him, offering another small smile. "Did you want another cookie?" she asked. The boy shook his head. Then, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is that your dad?" he asked, nodding toward the framed photo on the special table. Emma followed his gaze and nodded. "Yeah," she said softly, "that's him." The boy was silent for a moment, then said, "He must have been a good man." Emma felt her throat tighten. "He was," she whispered. "He really was." The boy stared into his cocoa for a long time. Then he looked up at her, his eyes wide and solemn. "I'm going to remember this forever," he said. The words hit Emma harder than she expected. She blinked rapidly, smiling even as tears pricked her eyes. "I hope you do," she said, "because that's what mattered. Not the size of the gift, not the cost, the memory, the feeling, the understanding that someone had seen you, someone had cared, even if just for a night, especially on a night like Christmas Eve." Later, after the dishes were washed and the last of the guests had trickled back into the snowy streets, Emma sat in one of the booths by the window, staring out into the swirling darkness. The boy had fallen asleep against the padded booth, his backpack clutched tightly in his arms. Emma didn't wake him. Instead, she leaned back and let the peace of the moment wash over her. Joe came over carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one down in front of her, sliding into the opposite seat. You did good tonight, kid, he said gruffly. Emma smiled, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. It wasn't just me, she said. Joe grunted, but there was a twinkle in his eye. Maybe, but it had to start with someone. They sat in companionable silence watching the snowfall. Outside, the world continued on busy, chaotic, complicated. But in here, in this little pocket of warmth and light, something simple and pure had been born. A tradition, perhaps, a ripple. A quiet act of kindness that would echo further than Emma would ever know. And she realized sitting there that this, not the presents, not the decorations, not the noise, was Christmas. This quiet, stubborn, beautiful belief that even in the coldest darkness, even in the deepest winter, kindness could bloom. It didn't need recognition. It didn't need reward. It just needed a willing heart and a place to begin. Before she left that night, Emma slipped outside into the freezing air. She stood for a moment under the street lamp, watching the snow fall, breathing in the sharp, clean cold. She closed her eyes and whispered into the night, "Thank you, Dad." And somewhere, whether in memory or in something deeper and more enduring, she felt the answer. A quiet warmth, a soft light, a promise kept. Snow fell through the night and into the morning, covering Willow Creek in a fresh, dazzling layer of white. Emma Collins rose early on Christmas Day, pulling on boots and a thick sweater before stepping out into the quiet dawn. The streets were empty, the world holding its breath in the pale gray light. She didn't have anywhere she needed to be. No shifts to cover, no hurried shopping to finish. Today belonged to memory, to reflection. She made her way toward the park at the edge of town, the one where her father had once taught her how to ride a bike, his hands steadying her until she could balance on her own, the bench near the frozen pond. Their bench was still there, half buried in snow. Emma brushed off the seat and sat down, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. For a long time she simply watched the snow drift in lazy spirals, watched the way the light caught on the ice, turning it into a field of diamonds. Watched the slow, steady breathing of a town at peace, and thought about how much had changed and how much hadn't. She wasn't sure how long she sat there before she noticed it. At first, it seemed like just another shape among the snowdrifts, but then she looked closer. On the far end of the bench, tucked neatly against the armrest, was a small brown paper package tied with a piece of red string. Emma blinked hard, giving a soft, surprised thump. She hadn't seen anyone approach, hadn't heard any footsteps. The package looked simple, ordinary. But something about it, the way it sat there waiting, felt deliberate, almost sacred. She hesitated, then reached out and picked it up. A small tag dangled from the string, handwritten in neat blocky letters, "For Emma, from someone who knows." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She untied the string carefully, her fingers clumsy with the cold. Inside, wrapped in layers of tissue paper, was a small object. She peeled it back. It was a compass. Old, worn smooth by years of handling, the brass tarnished but still shining faintly in the morning light. On the back, engraved in tiny, almost invisible letters, were the words, "Stay true, always." Emma turned it over in her hands, marveling at its weight, its simplicity, its quiet strength. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them, because she knew somehow, without needing an explanation, she knew. This had been her father's, or had belonged to someone he had trusted. Someone who had carried it through their own storms, their own nights lost in the cold, clinging to the belief that eventually light would return. And now it was hers, not because she had earned it through grand gestures or loud victories, but because she had chosen again and again to be kind when no one was watching, to stay true always. Emma closed her fingers around the compass, feeling its quiet heartbeat against her palm. The snow swirled around her, soft and endless, but she was not alone. Not anymore. Later that afternoon, back at the apartment, Emma placed the compass in the small wooden box on the bookshelf beside the old fishing lures, the faded photographs, the folded notes from a year ago. A new thread woven into the tapestry of memory. Her mother smiled when she saw it, but didn't ask questions. Some things didn't need to be explained. Some things were understood simply by the heart. In the days that followed, life in Willow Creek resumed its quiet rhythm. The community dinner became a new tradition, growing a little each year as word spread. People started bringing their own offerings, bush-sized casseroles, baskets of fruit. No one asked for anything in return. No one needed to. And every Christmas Eve, without fail, Emma reserved the same table at the front of the diner. The photograph of her father, the handwritten card. A single empty seat waiting for whoever needed it most. Some years the seat stayed empty all night. Other years a traveler or a lonely soul would slip quietly into the chair, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Emma never asked questions. She simply smiled and poured them coffee, because sometimes the greatest gift was simply being seen. In early spring, Emma received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photo. It showed the little boy from Christmas Eve, the one with the oversized coat and the wary eyes, standing proudly in front of a small brick house holding a key in one hand and a huge smile on his face. On the back of the photo, written in a careful childlike scrawl, were the words, "Thank you for the cookie and the cocoa. I have a home now. I won't forget." Emma pressed the photo to her chest, eyes blurring with tears. She had almost forgotten about the boy, caught up in the whirl of nursing school and part-time shifts, but he hadn't forgotten her, or the warmth of a single night when the world had seemed a little less cold. She smiled through her tears. That was the thing about kindness. It didn't always bloom where you expected, didn't always return in ways you could see, but it grew. It traveled. It reached places you might never visit, touched lives you might never meet, and sometimes it circled back to you carrying the quiet joy of knowing you had made a difference, even if only for a moment, especially then. The following Christmas Eve, Emma stood again behind the diner counter, tying her apron and scanning the room. The diner was packed. Laughter bubbled up from every corner. Plates clattered. Christmas music drifted from the jukebox. And at the front table, the one with the framed photo and the empty chair, a new addition sat beside the picture frame. The compass polished, cared for, waiting for the next traveler who might need a reminder. Stay true, always. Emma smiled, her heart full. The world could be loud and cruel and indifferent sometimes, but it could also be breathtakingly kind. And sometimes all it took was one bowl of soup, one gingerbread cookie, one open door, one hand reaching across the darkness, steady and sure, and the world tilted just a little back toward the light. Years later, Willow Creek still welcomed Christmas the same way it always had, with quiet anticipation. With snow-dusted rooftops and lights blinking patiently in the windows, with the slow, steady heartbeat of a town that knew the value of simple things, warm meals, kind words, open doors. Emma Collins, RN, stood once again inside the Willow Diner, fastening her apron, brushing a stray wisp of hair from her forehead. The diner was brighter now, the floors freshly polished, the walls repainted in soft, welcoming tones, but the heart of it remained unchanged. The same string of colored lights still framed the windows. The same battered jukebox in the corner still played the old carols, slightly off-key, but no less sincere. And at the front, as always, was the special table. A small framed photograph of Samuel Collins smiled up at the room. The handwritten card still stood beside it, reserved for all who gave quietly and for those still giving. And next to it, the compass, polished, treasured, waiting. A legacy passed from hand to hand. Emma moved through the diner with practiced ease, topping off coffee mugs, delivering plates heaped high with turkey and mashed potatoes, exchanging quiet smiles and nods. With faces both old and new, the community dinner had grown beyond anything she had ever expected. People drove from neighboring towns, now drawn not by free food, but by the warmth, the invisible thread of belonging that wove through the room like golden light. No questions asked, no expectations, just a place to sit, a place to be seen, a place to be remembered. Emma wouldn't have had it any other way. Near the end of the evening, as the last of the pies were being served and the coffee pots ran low, the diner door chimed again. Emma glanced up automatically, ready with a smile. A young girl stood hesitantly in the doorway, maybe 10 years old, maybe younger. Her coat was too thin for the bitter cold. Her sneakers were soaked through with slush. She clutched a small paper bag in her hands, crumpled from the cold and damp. Emma moved toward her immediately. "Hi there," she said warmly. "You're welcome to come in," the girl hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at the snowy darkness outside. Then she stepped forward, drawn by something more powerful than fear, hope. Emma led her to a booth near the kitchen, setting a warm mug of cocoa in front of her. The girl sat stiffly, hands wrapped tightly around the cup. "You're safe here," Emma said quietly. The girl didn't answer at first. Then she pulled something from her paper bag, a gingerbread cookie. Homemade, slightly lopsided, decorated with shaky lines of icing. She pushed it across the table toward Emma. "For you," the girl said shyly. "Merry Christmas." Emma's throat tightened. She accepted the cookie with careful hands, as if receiving something precious. "Thank you," she whispered. The girl smiled, a small fleeting thing, and began to eat her meal, savoring every bite with a hunger that went deeper than just an empty stomach. Emma sat with her a while, sipping coffee, sharing the silence. Because sometimes presence was the greatest gift you could offer. because sometimes kindness wasn't in grand gestures, but in the willingness to stay, to sit, to see. Later, when the diners had thinned out and the snow fell heavier, outside Emma stood once more by the front table, adjusting the photograph of her father, polishing the compass with a soft cloth. She placed the gingerbread cookie beside them, a new offering, a new thread in the tapestry they had woven over the years. Across the room, the young girl slept, curled up in the booth, her face peaceful under the soft glow of Christmas lights. Joe, older now, but still gruff, in the best way, wandered over 2 mugs of hot chocolate in hand. He set one down in front of Emma, grunting as he eased into the seat across from her. "You see that?" he asked, jerking his chin toward the sleeping girl. Emma smiled. "Yeah, she'll remember tonight," Joe said. "Maybe not all the details, maybe not the food or the songs, but she'll remember that someone made room for her." Emma nodded, her heart full to bursting. "That's the point," she said softly. Joe grunted, and again, his version of agreement, and sipped his cocoa. They sat there a long time watching the snow fall, the diner humming quietly around them. As midnight approached, Emma stepped outside into the cold. She stood under the old lamppost, breathing in the sharp air. Watching her breath rise in pale clouds, the town was silent except for the soft crunch of snow settling onto rooftops and trees. Above her, the stars blinked faintly through the clouds, steady and patient. Emma pulled the compass from her pocket, running her thumb over the familiar engraving. "Stay true always." She closed her eye, and for a moment, just a moment, she could almost feel her father's hand on her shoulder. Solid, steady, proud. She smiled, tilting her face up toward the stars. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for teaching me how to be kind when it was hard. Thank you for teaching me that quiet things matter. Thank you for trusting me to carry the light forward." And somewhere, whether in memory or in something greater, she felt the answer rise inside her. Keep going. Stay true always. In the years that followed, Emma would continue the Christmas Eve dinners. She would teach her own children, and someday maybe their children, that kindness was never wasted, that the quietest gestures sometimes echoed the longest, that a bowl of soup, a gingerbread cookie, a sit saved at the table could change the course of a life. She would tell them the story of a lonely Christmas Eve, a bowl of potato soup, and a stranger who whispered 7 words that changed everything. She would tell them about her father and about the town that remembered him not with parades or statues, but with open doors and open hearts. And she would tell them that the world would always need more of that kind of light, especially in the cold, especially in the dark, especially when no one else was looking, because sometimes the greatest revolutions started not with a roar, but with a whisper. "You matter. You are seen. You are not alone," and that was enough. That was everything. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.